Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Well Teacher Festival. If there's one thing that makes teachers feel that sort of tug of anxiety and that tug of stress, it is the management of behaviour in the classroom. It's the thing that keeps us up at night. Very luckily for us, today I'm really pleased to introduce Sam Strickland, who is a massively inspirational figure in education. He's not only a transformative head teacher, but he's the author of, I think, one of the best books on leadership that I have ever read, which is Education Exposed, and which is published by John Catt. And I was absolutely delighted when he agreed to do a 30-minute presentation on how to get the basics of behaviour right from the start of the year. And in this talk, it's absolutely jam-packed full of practical guidance. And Sam asked us to consider what would our perfect classroom culture look like. And then ultimately argues that we are the architects of that classroom culture. He then walks us through a number of practical strategies that we can instantly employ when we're back in that classroom environment in order to make that culture that we want to achieve into our reality. And he talks us through really how to make that as explicit and as clear as possible with young people. And often, training on behaviour management is packed full of gimmicks, which Sam reveals are ultimately nonsense. And he breaks it down in this talk to the fundamentals. So I hope you really enjoy it. And ultimately, I hope it helps you to feel as kind of calm and anxiety-free as it made me when I watched it. Thank you.
So my name's Sam Strickland. I'm the principal of the Dustin School in Northamptonshire. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter, my Twitter handle is @StrickoMaster. And if on the back of this fairly brief talk about behaviour and classroom culture, you'd like to hear more, or rather read more about what I have to say on this topic, you might be interested in my book, Education Exposed. That's my shameless plug. So this session is all about getting behaviour, getting your classroom culture right from the start. And I think it is so important that kind of from the word go of meeting a new class, you establish and assert your expectations, your routines, your classroom culture on those pupils so that they understand what the norm is in your classroom setting. Some referral points for you where actually you can read quite a lot and hopefully engage with some further ideas. Tom Bennett has produced a guide, he produced a guide for the Department for Education entitled Creating a School Culture. You can download this for free off Google. It's about 92 pages long. And whilst it's geared towards schools in a general sense, there are many ideas in there that you can draw out and utilise as a class-based teacher. Doug Lemov's Teach Like a Champion, which I appreciate many people within the profession are aware of. But that is a really powerful book with lots of teaching strategies that you can employ to help create the right culture for your classroom setting. Tom Sherrington's Rose and Shine is a brilliant read. It's short, snappy, and to the point, but Tom really delves into the ins and outs of Rose and Shine. And again, in terms of creating and establishing your classroom culture, there are many ideas in there that can really assist you with building your classroom culture. And then the EEF have produced a series of behaviour interventions through their behaviour intervention report, which again is free to download on the internet. But again, there are strategies in there that you might wish to read up for any more detail about and trial within your own classroom settings as well. So kind of a starting point within all of this is really the issues around behaviour, and more importantly, behaviour training and training around creating a culture within your classroom. And I suppose really the starting point for me is, when do we actually get training on behaviour management, on behaviour training in its fullest sense? And I think throughout the course of my career, I had a 1 hour workshop as a PGCE student, whereby I was told to use palms down approach and raised eyebrows, kind of looking a bit like Buzz Lightyear, as being one of the main behaviour management tools within my classroom setting. And then very little was actually delivered to me, actually throughout the course of my career, about how to drive behaviour within my classroom setting, departmental setting, as a senior leader of the part of the school that I was driving. Most of it came through my own experience and getting things wrong, getting things right through a process of trial and error. And I think there's a lot to suggest and to state, really, that positive behaviour amongst pupils is something that is assumed. And it's assumed that we as teachers can simply just command the respect of our pupils, and not something that's really taught. Equally, and this is probably quite a conservative statistic as well, but somewhere around a quarter of the profession believe that behaviour across schools is not good. And that's quite a disturbing statistic, really. And even in schools that are judged to be good or outstanding, there are elements of poor behaviour in those, maybe not in all of those schools, but certainly a number of those schools. And then the final point is that behaviour management tends to be reactionary. We tend to respond to behaviour once behaviour has happened, as opposed to preempting poor behaviour and trying to deal with it before it arises. And you probably don't need me to tell you this, but poor behaviour is kryptonite. It's kryptonite to our classroom culture. It's kryptonite to our ability to deliver our lessons. It's kryptonite to the learning within the classroom setting. It's kryptonite to our workload. It's kryptonite to our well-being and our job satisfaction as well. If I think about what I call the Hausian dream, most people have become teachers either because they have an absolute passion for their subject, because they want to help people, or they want to inspire pupils. And poor behaviour is one of a number of things that really gets in the way of that Hausian dream. And a starting point which we all need to consider very carefully is that we permit what we promote, and we promote what we permit. And whatever we allow our pupils to get away with, whatever we turn a blind eye to, the pupils will deem that to be an acceptable behaviour that there will be no consequence for, there'll be no reprimand, there'll be no discussion over in terms of it being inappropriate, and it will be potentially at its worst a behaviour that becomes accepted if it's something that we are not tackling and not dealing with, and therefore permitting and promoting. So kind of the vision for behaviour is, I don't think we can shy away from this. To instill good behaviour in our pupils requires effort, irrespective of what school you work in, whether it's a leafy Middle England school, a grammar school, an RI school, a special measures school. There is always a degree of effort that is involved in trying to ensure that behaviour remains positive, and it always requires follow through. Another aspect with kind of the vision here is that I don't really believe that there are bad teachers, and teachers can teach and teachers can improve. And the thing that kind of prohibits many teachers from being able to do the core job, and the core job is teaching, is behaviour. Another aspect within the vision is that we need routines, and we need a clear set of strategies that we consistently utilise and consistently adhere to create a degree of certainty with our pupils, so that they know exactly where the line is and exactly how to behave within our lessons. And ultimately, tricks and gimmicks simply do not work in our classrooms. And there are misconceptions, I would argue, around behaviour as well. A common misconception, and it's being pushed, even at some of the more senior qualifications that are out there in terms of professional development courses like NPQSL, NPQH even, is this idea that good planning results in good behaviour. Now, don't get me wrong, good planning is important, of course it is, and a good execution of your lesson is important, of course it is, and that will help contribute, no doubt, to positive behaviour in a lesson. But to simply believe and to simply state that really good planning will lead to good behaviour is actually really quite naive. If I worked in a really challenging school where daily pupils told me precisely where to go, and I decided to bring in David Beckham to do a series of free kicks with my pupils in my class, and I had Obama going to deliver a speech, well, the chances are, coupled with the best planned lesson on earth, if the culture isn't right, the pupils probably wouldn't engage. Another misconception is that poor behaviour is the teacher's fault. It's the teachers that have caused this bad behaviour. And the danger with this is it leads to a situation of teacher natural selection in schools, where those teachers who are strong personalities, who are charismatic, who are dynamic, potentially at its worst, who bribe the pupils, actually get the behaviour that they want and become kind of these elevated hero teachers, while the rest of the teachers actually suffer. Another misconception is that the senior team simply do not need to drive behaviour and don't need to deal with it. And it kind of goes to that Hakuna Matata kind of a mindset that behaviour isn't, my responsibility. Another misconception is where you hear people say, oh, they behave for me. It's that classic, almost toxic staff room line. They behave for me. I don't know what the problem is. They should probably behave for you, shouldn't they? That's a dangerous statement. And then the final kind of misconception, and it is shared still by some people, is the idea that having routines for learning, especially if they're institutionally driven, somehow limits teacher autonomy and reduces teacher freedom for thought, pupil freedom for thought. And I think this is utter tosh. Routines for learning, and if I go back to that Tom Bennett report, which I cited at the start, routines for learning are something that really underpins some of the most successful schools in this country. And if there's a clear and consistent routine, which is habitual, which is taught, which is followed through, pupils then are in a position where they misbehave less, actually they behave, and you can teach, and that gives you far greater autonomy as a teacher and indeed as a pupil to think about the content of the lesson, as opposed to all of the discussions in a lesson being about behaviour, per se. I think something that we really do need to emphasise and to be aware of is that nothing should be left to chance, and behaviour is actually something that should be taught. It is a subject in its own right, and it is something that we have to be completely explicit about. And routines, which I think will underpin everything that you do in terms of your classroom culture, are something you do need to instill and teach and explain and model and remodel to your pupils. So some starting points, and these are more things for you to ponder on and think about. What's the classroom culture that you want? What do you want your idealistic halcyon dream to be for your class? What do you want the pupils to do from the minute they come to your classroom door to where they sit down, to how they engage from one activity to the next, how your lessons transition, to how they leave? And I think it's really important that you map this out, that you have a draft written down of what you want your ideal class culture to be. And this should become really the aspiration, the benchmark to which you will work toward and work your pupils toward, and you'll consistently have in all of your lessons for whatever year group that you're teaching, or if you're primary phase, for your class to be engaging with. You need to communicate that culture really effectively to the pupils. And again, you need to think about how you're going to do that. And then you need to teach that culture and maintain that culture. So if you want the pupils to line up at the door, you need to show them and you need to make it explicit. If you want pupils to pass their books down to the end of their rows, or into the middle of their tables, or whatever it is, you need to make that explicit and show them how to do it. If you want your pupils to not use hands in your classroom environment, whatever's in keeping, of course, with your school, you need to teach them in how to do that. I think it's also important to think about the rules that underpin your classroom setting as well. And some schools, I take my own school as I'm being really biased here, as a case in point, is really explicit about our classroom rules. We have 3, which make up our classroom code of conduct, which can be seen on the graphic here. There's an American educationist called Mazzano who says that you should have 4 rules that underpin your classroom setting. The first one is quiet when the teacher is talking. And the only kind of criticism I would make of this first rule is that word quiet. I personally believe that quiet leads to ambiguity. Your definition of quiet and my definition of quiet might be very different. And for me, I believe in either silence or talking. But the second rule is that we follow directions straight away, right away. The third bit is that third rule is that we allow others to get on with their work. And the fourth rule is that we respect each other. And within my own school setting, we've adapted this to go into kind of a rule of 3. I believe in having 3 kind of clear, discernible rules or expectations that underpin our classroom code of conduct. Now, you might work in a school, and when I talk about schools, in 2 terms. One is the mothership, the school itself, and then the other is the satellite, the departments, the classes that make up the school. You might have a very clear directive from your school of what is permissible and accepted and what the rules are. And that's great. And so long as your classroom setting works towards that, brilliant. You might work, however, in a school where that is far loose and far more disparate and kind of left to you and your own devices. So again, if I go back, knowing the culture you want, I think it's really important if you work in a school which is that level of autonomous or that level of autonomy is given to you, that you need to decide what the rules are for you that are going to underpin your classroom setting, and your pupils need to work toward those. And routines ultimately become a behaviour standardised by you and carried out by your pupils habitually, effectively and on cue, so that they are an habitual routine. It's just something that is automatically done. And the key to whatever routine it is that you're trying to establish with your pupils is to model it. So first you need to show them what it is. This is how we line up. This is how you talk to me. This is how you answer questions. This is how we hand our books out. Then they practice it. And then you get them to repeat it and repeat it until it becomes an habitual routine. And that might take a series of lessons to do that. But I think it's important that you label this from the start. It's also important to have in mind that irrespective of how strong or how diluted the direction from the school may be, ultimately as a class teacher, you are the architect of your class culture. And I would argue you need to front load your expectations at the start of when you meet your new class or classes. You need to repeat those expectations so that they become drilled into the pupils' minds. They know that in your lessons, that's how they should behave for you, that you always follow through with where things aren't as you want them to be. I think it's also important if a lesson isn't going the way that you want it to go, you stop the lesson to reinforce your expectations, to make your point. You can, and some people will advocate doing this, tactically ignore behaviour. But I would argue you also need to tactically follow it up. And it might be, your class of 30, there's one person in the room who all the 29 other pupils ignore in terms of their poor behaviour. And they're constantly making noises for sake of argument, which actually could undermine your lesson if you challenge in front of everybody. But whilst you've tactically ignored, a grunting noise that pupil might be making for sake of argument, you're going to follow it up at the end and have a conversation with them about how that is an inappropriate behaviour. Never ever condone rudeness towards you as well as a teacher. Ultimately, and we should all be kind of put on this same pedestal, I would argue, as teachers. The teacher is the expert. They're the expert in the classroom. They are the absolute expert in their subject domain, and there should be a degree of automatic respect to staff. And I think when you condone rudeness, that erodes that absolutely critical position that you have. I think it's important as well that you use positive approaches to pupils. You don't want to go in from the word go aggressive and angry and negative. You will get pupils offside if you do that. And the final bit really here, I think it's important that you keep your pupils busy and you work very effectively and very slickly in your lessons. And the utilization of timings is really, really important, including even just transition from one activity to the next and how worksheets are handed out for sake of argument. It's thinking about that intricate detail about how your lessons flow. And it's back to not leaving things to chance. Most important thing is to nip issues in the bud. If you leave something, it will manifest, it will snowball, it will become a bigger issue. If pupil X feels they can be rude to you today and it goes unchallenged, well, guess what? They're going to be rude to you the next time they see you, and the next time, and the next time. And the longer you leave it, the more it will become, unfortunately, kind of a challenge or a joke if you haven't actually dealt with it in the first instance. And then some strategies for you to employ and for you to ponder on and think about as to whether they would work for you as a teacher, to redirect pupils to the behaviour that you want. You can give closed choices to pupils. You can do that activity now, or guess what? You're going to do it at lunchtime. So you're giving a closed choice, and you need to think about closed choices that will actually work for you and how you operate in any one given day. You can bracket the behaviour. So it might be you've got 4 pupils sat together in a row or in a pod. 3 of them are on task, 1 isn't. You might praise the 3 pupils who are doing exactly what you want, but tactically ignore the one that isn't, with the hope that that might be enough to trigger them. And sometimes that is enough to trigger a pupil into action. You can give time pressures. We've now only got 3 minutes left on this task, folks. I expect it to be completed. Sometimes that's enough to push, 1 or 2 of those pupils who may not be where they should be into a bit more action. You can do quite casual questioning. Sam, how's that work going? That can be enough for people to kind of self-realize they're not doing what they should be doing. The classic, which I was taught my PGCE, the steady stare, and you need to be careful how long you do this for. Otherwise, it could come across as though that you're being aggressive. But I think, to stare at people as if to say, come on now, I think is fair. You can give non-verbal signals. So you might have a pen in your hand, you might point at a pupil, and you might do like a handwriting gesture with the pen, and that's enough to trigger them into action. Close proximity, kind of standing close to the pupil and looking down at the work that they're doing, and then actually engaging them in a conversation about how's that work going. You can mirror behaviours as well. You're talking really loudly and saying it loudly back to mirror the fact that the pupil is being loud. I've already referenced this, but ambiguity in our lessons is actually really dangerous. I'd like a bit of quiet now. I'd like a bit of hush. 2 classic lines I see teachers use, and they're meaningless, if I'm honest. Either you want pupils to talk or you don't want them to talk. So you either want talking or you want silence. And I think you need to get rid of the grey. You can have private interventions with pupils where you talk to them, ask them how they're going. Another strategy is to use surnames. Mr. Smith, Mr. Strickland, Mr. Jones, Miss Underwoods, Miss Howard, etc. Pupils really like that, and it makes them feel very grown up, and it feels like they're being respected by you as well. That's a really good approach to use, and it does engage pupils with you because they do feel that there's a degree of respect being shown to them through the use of surnames, and that you're treating them like an adult. And then also where you stand. Once you've got your class underway on an activity, one of the worst places you can stand is at the front, because the pupils can see you and they can see whether you're paying attention to them or not, or whether you're distracted by talking to a pupil or not. If you stand at the back and scan the room, the pupils don't know where you are. and they are more likely to have their heads down and engaging with the work. It also makes it easier for you to scan the room if you're stood at the back, because you can very quickly see if there's private interventions or discussions, taking place between pupils, if pupils are off track, if they're doing things that they shouldn't be doing, swinging on their chairs, you name it, you can see it really, really quickly. So it's just about that kind of positioning within the room can make such a difference. So I hope that's useful to you. I hope that gives you some ideas and some questions for you to think about and to ponder on about making sure your classroom environment is what you'd like it to be.